Hello, everybody. We are going to be talking today about the evaluation method called outcome harvesting. Let's take a look at what outcome harvesting is all about. So outcome harvesting is a method of evaluation. It is where you collect or harvest evidence of what has changed or the outcomes, and then working backwards determines whether and how an intervention has contributed to these changes. So the key word is working backwards. It is an evaluation method where you start this process at a certain point during the intervention. It does not take place prior. You do not start outcome harvesting in the planning phase, nor do you start at the beginning of an intervention. This occurs later on down the line. So let's look at the background and who really founded this evaluation approach. So outcome harvesting was inspired by outcome mapping, and it is informed by utilization-focused evaluation, right? It was developed by a man by the name of Ricardo Wilson Grau and his colleagues who, as co-evaluators, applied it in different circumstances and further refined it over many years of evaluation practice. And Ricardo Wilson Grau has offered a lot of written materials that are accessible as resources for anyone who wants to use this method. So let us now take a look at some of the key outcome harvesting vocabularies or concepts in order for us to understand the, how outcome harvesting is done. So first of all, you need to understand the concept of the change agent. The change agent is the individual or organization that influences an outcome through the intervention. You also have the harvest users. The harvest users are the people who require the findings of an outcome harvest to make decisions or to take action. In other words, they're the ones who benefit from this evaluation in order to proceed with further, programs and processes. You also have the harvesters, who are the people responsible for managing the outcome harvest, right? So they're the ones who are actually doing the evaluation. You also have the outcome description, which is the written formulation of who changed what, when and where, and how it was influenced by a change agent. This may include the outcome's significance, context, and history, amongst other dimensions. You have the outcome harvest, which is the identification, formulation, analysis, and interpretation of outcomes to answer usable questions. You have the outcome itself, which is the change in the behavior, relationships, actions, activities, policies, or practices of a social actor. You have the social actor, which is the individual, the group, the community, the organization, or the institution. You have the substantiation, which is confirmation of the substance of an outcome description by an informant knowledgeable about the outcome, but independent of the change agent. And you also have useful questions, which are questions that can guide the outcome harvest because the answers to them will be put to use by the harvest. Now let's take a look at the 6 essential steps in outcome harvesting. So the first step is to design the harvest. So now let's take a look at the 6 essential steps to outcome harvesting. The first step is to design the harvest itself. Okay, so you're designing this evaluation. The second step is to review the documentation and draft the outcomes. Okay, so this is probably the most lengthy step because you're retracing the outcomes. The third step is to engage with the informants, right? So this is where you are talking with the team members to find out more. The fourth steps is to substantiate. The fifth step is to analyze and interpret. And finally, the sixth and final step is to support the use of findings. So taking a little bit of a closer look at these 6 steps, the first step was to design the outcome harvest. That's where you identify the primary intended users of the harvest and their intended uses for the harvest findings. Who should be involved in outcome harvesting? Well, this is a highly participatory process, which is necessary for a successful outcome harvesting process and product. So this includes either internal or external people, which are the harvesters. Okay, and that is who is designated to lead the outcome harvesting process. The harvest users are individuals or organizations requiring the findings to make decisions or take action, as we mentioned before. The second step which is reviewing the documentation and draft outcomes. This is where the harvest users and harvesters agree with what needs to be known, right? And they write useful, actionable questions to guide the harvest, which are the harvesting questions. At a minimum, this involves obtaining information about the changes in social actors and how the intervention influenced them. The third step involves reviewing documentation, okay? And so this is where, you know, you look at reports, previous evaluations, press releases, other documentation, you know, the harvesters identify potential outcomes or changes in individual groups, communities, organizations, or institutions, and what the intervention did to contribute to them. The fourth step, which is to substantiate, this is where you engage with informants in formulating outcome descriptions. Okay, let me restate that. So in the third step, you engage with informants in formulating outcome descriptions. The harvesters engage directly with informants to review the outcome descriptions based on document review and identify and formulate additional outcomes. The fourth step is to check with a third party. That is where you substantiate your findings. The fifth step is where the harvesters classify all the outcomes. And finally, in the sixth step, this is where you support the use of your findings, or the harvesters propose issues for discussion to harvest users grounded in the evidence-based answers to the harvesting questions. Let us take a look at when outcome harvesting is particularly useful, because as we mentioned, this is a very particular type of evaluation tool. It is not meant for every situation. Outcome harvesting is particularly useful in complex situations when it is not possible to define concretely most of what an intervention aims to achieve, or even what specific actions will be taken over a multi-year period. Okay, so in other words, you do not do outcome harvesting from the planning or the beginning phases of an intervention. This is something you do kind of during the process, or perhaps at the end of a process, in order to evaluate how it will move forward. So when outcomes and even inputs and activities and outputs are not sufficiently specific or measurable at the time of planning and intervention, that's when you use outcome harvesting. Thus, it's very well suited for evaluation in dynamic or uncertain or complex situations. It's really great for assessing social change interventions, innovation and developmental work, for ongoing developmental, midterm, formative, and end of term summative evaluations. It can be used by itself or in combination with other approaches. Let's look at some examples. For example, it could be used in a situation where a religious leader is making a proclamation that's unprecedented or considered to be important. It could be used where there's a change in behavior between organizations or between communities, changes in regulations, formal laws, or cultural norms. Outcome harvesting has been used and documented in over 143 countries in government and non-governmental organizations, in community-based organizations and networks, in universities and research institutes, in Evaluation Office of the United Nations Developmental Program. 10 teams of the World Bank Institute and funding agencies have used it, as well as USAID chose outcome harvesting for monitoring and evaluation in dynamic, uncertain situations. So these are just some of the examples where outcome harvesting has been used successfully. We also want to look at the uniqueness of this evaluation approach. Why would you use it versus traditional methods? So let's look at a few of those points. So for example, and this is provided by Ricardo Wilson Grau, the founder himself. So for example, in a traditional evaluation method, that you would assess an intervention testing the predetermined activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact for efficiency and effectiveness. So the key word here would be pre. But in outcome harvesting, you assess what was achieved on the level of outcomes and how activities and outputs contributed. So you're basically looking at the outcomes and going backwards in your evaluation. Another example or another factor is that in traditional evaluations, evaluators are perceived as independent and objective, right? So many times you may have an outside evaluator that you hire to come in, right, who's outside of the situation. But in outcome harvesting, evaluators are perceived as collaborative. They're part of the team. Another point is that a traditional evaluation provides judgment on success or failure of a project, program, or organization, whereas an outcome harvest provides evidence of what outcomes were achieved and how, and answers questions about, so what do the outcomes mean for a project, program, or organization? You also have, in traditional evaluation tools, a focus on fidelity of a project or program intervention to the logic model, whereas in outcome harvesting, you're actually focused on what happens, whether that was intended to happen or not intended. So many times you have, you have an entire project which is implemented, and there are unintended outcomes, which could be good or bad or whatever, but you are retracing your steps to go back and see how that occurred or where that happened. I wanted to touch upon some of the strengths and limitations of outcome harvesting, because I thought that would go along with how it's unique. So some of the strengths is that it overcomes the common failure to search for unintended outcomes of interventions. It generates verifiable outcomes because you are kind of starting from the end. So everything that you find is going to have a path that led up to it. It also uses a common sense, accessible approach that engages informants quite easily. It employs various data collection methods, such as interviews and surveys, face-to-face, by telephone, by email, workshops, and document review, and answers actionable questions with concrete evidence. There are also some limitations or challenges with outcome harvesting, which is why you really can't use it for every situation. First of all, it takes a lot of skill and time. It takes timeliness that are required to identify and formulate high quality outcome descriptions, right? So it's not something that's just really quickly done. It requires an investment of time. And only those outcomes that informants are aware of are captured. So they're, you're not going to know about something that was not known by the participants. It also starts with the outcomes, and working backwards represents a new way of thinking about change for some participants. Okay, let's take a look at some of the resources about outcome harvesting. First of all, it is relatively a new evaluation process. So the founder is still, alive and providing resources. His name is Ricardo Wilson Grau. He provided a lot of information that is accessible. So if you go to betterevaluation.org, there is a lot of good material there, which is excerpts from his original writing. There's a Vimeo that is just with the founder himself. There are some videos on YouTube as well that summarize outcome harvesting. There is a very useful downloadable 31-page document that you can find at outcomemapping.ca / so on and so forth. So if you just click on this link here, there is a downloadable 31-page document there. You can also look at outcomeharvesting.net / documents. Now, I would like to do a practice activity in order for us to utilize this evaluation method of outcome harvesting. So this is what we are going to be evaluating. The social change that we're looking at is online schooling versus brick and mortar. And this is very, very relevant considering this entire COVID lockdown that we've had this whole entire year and a half. And so the situation that we are measuring is the end of semester or the end of 2021 assessment and GPA data. So what is the change that's being observed? We're going to look at test scores, academic performance, evidence of mastery, and we're going to do an outcome harvest that kind of reaches back to these options of online schooling versus brick and mortar, and kind of investigate what we find out. And I really look forward to finding out what you come up with in your outcome harvest. So that is our brief discussion of outcome harvesting. I look forward to hearing from all of you. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can look at those resources that we discussed. And I invite you to do more research on this evaluation method. Thank you very much.